and then basically doing the calculations there. They're just reading it off of the AP newsfeed or ESPN or somewhere and then copying it. We ended up coming across this situation occurring on Fark on a pretty early basis. And just for the record, I don't really care if people copy stuff off Fark. I don't care if they find news stories on Fark. We don't own them. It's not our deal. What I do care about is when they start like reading it word for word or going into the comments and pulling out all the good jokes and using them in, say, Jay Leno's monologues, which has been happening with frighteningly regular basis lately. To the point where we've actually started keeping a little file. When it gets up to about 100, we're going to call those guys and see what they got going on. But at any rate, early on in Fark's history, right around 9/11, nothing funny was going on for about a week. And after a while, this got to be really tedious. And so on the Sunday after 9/11, I put up a little thing on the website and said, basically, you know, we need to get something funny going on here. Since the media isn't coming up with any funny news articles, why don't you go back into the archives and find what you think are the best stories that you ever saw on Fark, and we'll just run those again. So we did. One of the stories in particular was a 18-month-old article from, of all places, the Lexington Herald Leader, which is my hometown newspaper, about the correlation between creativity and people being crazy. Basically talking about how people that have they've been having problems with people getting on Prozac and other depression medications and then losing their ability to create. Interestingly enough, I've run into a couple artists who are very successful. Dale Chihuly actually being one of them. I don't know who he is or not, but not important. Who, when he's on his medication, he can't function. I mean, he can function as a human being. He can't create anything. It totally saps it away. He has to actually go off his medication for a while in order to actually do stuff, and so he just kind of does that whenever he gets a chance. So we put this thing up online, and Ananova ran it as breaking news. So I contacted him and I said, "Hey, you guys got that off our website, you know, and that's cool and all, but I would really appreciate some return traffic because I'd run the stats on our database, and at the time we had sent them almost 1 million page views." Just in the year and a half since we've been tracking the stats at all. And I figured, hey, just, give us, if you're getting so much of your stuff from us, just, mention us once in a while. That'd be great. And they're like, no, we didn't. That came through our newswire. An 18-month-old article from my local newspaper just came through your newswire as a news flash. And so that's the long version of why we don't like Ananova anymore, because they don't like us and screw them, basically. But you see that stuff like that, though, happens all the time. Like I said, radio stations do it on a pretty regular basis. One of the more strange times of my life where I actually picked up on that was I was driving across Indiana once, heading back to my wife's parents' place in Iowa. And I was going through listening to the Bob and Tom show one morning, and they ran an article that they had seen in Afton Posted, which had been on our website. And I felt fairly positive that Bob and Tom did not have a guy reading Norway's state newspaper trying to find stories. So I wrote him and I said, hey, are you guys using Fark as a source for your material? And the guy that wrote back is like, nah, I don't think so. He's like, I'll ask around. And about 3 days later, wrote back, he's like, yeah, actually we are. Is that okay? And I said, yeah, that's fine. It'd just be nice if you mentioned us once in a while. Well, they didn't for about 2 years, but eventually they had me on a couple times, so it was okay. But at any rate, it's one of those things that you could argue that it's just another sign of how the media is degrading, except that the copying of the stories and also basically the just kind of filling in the blanks with BS stories and whatnot, except that there are actually historical records that are very similar. For example, the Hindenburg disaster. The initial news reports from that are full of all kinds of inconsistencies because they basically didn't have the information and they wrote up. In fact, the real cause of the Hindenburg disaster was only publicized recently, and it had nothing to do with what they originally thought it was. I won't go into the details of it, but it's fairly interesting. Somebody talked to me in the bar about this later on, and this isn't one of those tinfoil hat things. It was a PBS special I thought was really coated the short version is they coated the outside of the Hindenburg with rocket fuel. No kidding. They didn't know it was rocket fuel. They just found out the hard way. The Titanic disaster was the same way. There was a lot of misinformation that came out around that at the same time. And you could actually see the misinformation go from the New York Times to the smaller town newspapers as it's copied verbatim over and over and over again. I again, have done no studies on this, but I'm fairly positive that, you could go back in time 150 years to Kansas City, and the local newspaper editor would open up the copy of the New York Times that he got sent to him every day, which, wouldn't arrive for about 2 weeks, and he'd just start going down through there, cut some stuff up with his scissors, and reprint it. I think it's something that's been going on since the beginning of time. And it's one of those things that's just, easier to do. But it was interesting to me to see how prevalent it is. Essentially, there are only, as far as I can tell, about 3 sources of media of news stuff: AP, Reuters, and then local newspapers. And by local, I mean like ground level stuff, like something that happened in the community that you wouldn't have otherwise come across. And in general, anything that makes it into the AP, even if it's wrong, even if it's obviously wrong, will get printed. And it goes back to plausible deniability again. It's one of those things where they can say, well, you know, we picked it up off the AP. We didn't know it was wrong. They're supposed to be checking that stuff. And generally, the AP is pretty good about getting stuff right, but it's one of those things where newspapers that know better, that have AP feeds, will just pass this stuff on because they know that there's absolutely no retribution for them whatsoever. Yes? Oh, are there? Oh, sure, yeah. Oh, good. Yep. Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense, and that goes into something that I'm kind of moving in the direction of talking about the future of media and how that's going to go. That's essentially what seems to me to be the breakdown of the way things are headed. Media is basically going to have to decide what it is. Back in the day, you had your local newspaper would have been the local source for basically all your straight up news. Maybe your TV station would have been too, or it would have been a network television that would be the main source of all hard news. Now what's happening is that with 3,000 media sites out on the internet, basically all saying the same thing, they're going to have to differentiate in order to be able to survive. And in order to do that, they're going to have to frame their news one way or the other. They can either take the high road, be like CNN, say, well, we're just going to report news and that's it, or go the political route like Fox and basically filter all their stuff through a conservative or a liberal viewpoint. Or, in my opinion, the third thing, which is what's happening with The Daily Show. I think it's either a matter of time before either The Daily Show morphs into a news network, or they create one that looks very similar, but it's the same thing. It's filtering it through a humor filter rather than through anything else. And when you're talking about what the AP is doing there with the same story, that seems to be kind of the conclusion that they've reached as well. That they realize that they're going to have to send that out and flavor it depending on who it is that they're going to be buying that thing from. That's going to be a real pain in the ass for me, though, because that just means that every article that I get, you have to see 2,000 times a day anyway, is going to come in 6,000 times a day. Great. Speaking of AP, interestingly enough, one of the things that we've been working on, we're actually getting an AP news feed for FARC. Since it occurred to me, I saw all the traffic we've been sending to Yahoo over the years for the AP feeds, and I'm just like, well, Christ, we should just do that ourselves. This isn't that expensive, and so we're hooking it up. Turns out the problem is that the way they have the AP feed set up, if you're running it on Windows boxes, they've got like a plug-and-play thing where they just give it to you and it runs. If you don't, then you have to build it yourself, and that's been kind of the holdup. They say that they have a lot of news sites out there that do that, but they read their own thing, and so they haven't really come up with anything that you can just drop in and use. So that's their big holdup on that. But that'll be interesting to see how that goes. I already talked about the fake research and statistics. Like I said, there's a whole bunch of other ones out there too. I mean, it's kind of like, it sits on the level of like an uber urban legend, not necessarily like, because the urban legends are fairly obvious eventually, but the uber ones I'm talking about are stuff like the one about where back in the .com boom, WorldCom was claiming that internet traffic was doubling every 100 days. Well, they just repeated it because, no one's checking that kind of stuff. It turned out to be completely bogus. They were basically using it to inflate their stock value by hyping the fact that we're an internet company. We're going to be really big. Look at us grow. Our stock value should double every 100 days is what they were really saying. But it was just one of those things, again, like I said, where if somebody else says it, the media's got plausible deniability. They can just go ahead and run it. It's no big deal. There are other examples too, like saying there were 9/11 families that were supposedly suing Iraq for $116 trillion or whatever. They had basically made a mistake and they had added 3 zeros by accident. And again, no one ever picked it up. They didn't even really care. No, excuse my lack of organization here. This is pretty much how I operate anyways. Yeah, speaking of the future of news organizations, this is something else that I found kind of interesting. The local newspapers, I don't know if you guys are aware, somebody made a crack at a news conference that I went to. They jokingly referred to FARC as a parasite. It was an obvious joke. The guy looked at me and smiled when he did, and everybody in the room laughed because they knew I was sitting in there. Where, basically they're claiming that we're living off of the content that other people are creating. And I've actually had people come up and say, well, FARC doesn't have any content in itself. I'm not necessarily going to dispute that. But it's interesting to point out to people the other organizations that live in that same niche. And one of those is your local newspaper, without a doubt. And I'm talking even at the Cleveland level. The newspapers here are doing AP, Reuters, or Knight Ridder news coming in nationally, occasionally writing something that goes back the other direction, but not often. Most people's local newspapers have staffs that only write local sports, high school stuff, maybe college if you have a college team in your town, and movie reviews and restaurant openings. That's it. And if you think about it, next time you open your newspaper, check it out. Look at the bylines. If you ever see like Larry Smith and the AP, well, that and the AP is 90% of the article. Larry Smith may have tweaked a couple words or added a couple like extra paragraphs in there. But it's interesting that they were referring to FARC as being a parasitic entity when in fact most of the news organizations out there function exactly the same way. It's one of those things most people aren't aware of, and it's been kind of gradually happening because back in the day, when these newspapers got going 100 years ago, they did have staffs that went out and found this stuff firsthand and did it, or at least copied out of the New York Times or whatever they did. But it's very interesting to see that the newspapers are kind of having an interesting conundrum now because their circulations are dropping. People ages 18 to 35 are not buying subscriptions. It's not that people are canceling them. Well, the people are canceling. They're dying. As the older folks die, those canceled subscriptions are not getting picked up by people our age. They're just basically dropping off the face of the planet. And this is some cause of concern for the newspapers, obviously. They really don't know how to reverse it. They've come up with some pretty bizarre ideas. One of the things they threw out pretty quickly back in the early days was that a lot of newspapers experimented with forcing you to go through their front page to get to their news. They basically blocked all deep linking. The idea was based off there's actually some like newspaper theory type concepts, one of which is send everybody through the front page and then shoot them through the first section to the back to read. And you guys have probably noticed this. I mean, like the front page of any newspaper's got 4 or 5 articles, and then it'll be cut in half and say, continued on page A9 or whatever. The reason they do that is they want you to cycle past the ads repeatedly, over and over again. It's ad exposure, basically. It's page views, literally. Yeah, as you cycle through the newspaper, you go read your one article, you go back to the front, you say, oh, there's another one. You go back through it again, you go buy all those ads a second time, and so on and so forth. They ended up stopping doing that, though, because newspapers that switched to that format quickly lost all of their traffic. Turns out people don't read newspapers on the internet like that. Who'd have known? People tend to jump in and out on specific pages. It's something that most of the newspapers have kind of come accustomed to, including the ones that require registration. Which brings me to the second failed concept of newspapers, which is the registration thing. Even newspapers that do registration, the employees that work for them have told me that they don't think it's a really good idea either. Most of them have opened it up so that they can allow Google News, or in some cases us, actually, to go through. I have not been able to get a hold of anybody over at the New York Times. We have been not linking them so long, they don't realize that we can generate any traffic, so I'm not getting any love over there when I call up and tell them, hi, we're this news site you've never heard of. You should come let us link to you guys, and no one ever writes back. They all realize that that's not working. In fact, I've seen a couple articles go through on Wired Magazine talking about how it's looking to be the case that the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are effectively writing themselves off of the internet. Because when you do searches for news articles, their articles don't come up at all. If you do, and in fact, that is one of the major reasons why Bloomberg and CBS Market Watch and all those other financial websites have succeeded. It's because the Wall Street Journal let them. It's because you couldn't get to them on the internet, and as a result, they ended up kind of reducing themselves in relevance as far as internet searches were concerned. They don't necessarily care about this. I mean, there's a certain ivory tower mentality that exists among newspaper editors anyway, and by all rights, they're not wrong. A good example is you've got situations where people running newspapers in general came up through the organization from start to finish, from the bottom to the top, and they've been doing the same thing the same way for 70 years, and it's one of these ain't broke, don't fix it type situations, except now they're starting to realize that things actually are broken. Interestingly, I had the fortune to be at a newspaper conference about 2 years ago and attended a conference on how to set up your newspaper site for registration, which was of great interest to me, so I decided to go down and check it out because I think it's the stupidest thing I've ever seen in my life. And as it turns out, the major motivation for newspaper sites to have registration in the first place is so they can harvest your emails and sell them to spammers. No shit. They actually came out and said this in the conference. One of the guys asked the question to the person who was talking about how easy it was and how it's a good idea and how your traffic doesn't drop when you require registration. They said, well, what is the value in this? And they said, well, you can sell them to the spammers for $0.25 a pop. And the guy said, well, how do you prevent people who don't want to be spammed to from having that happen? And they're like, well, we make it very obvious when you sign up on your news site that you can click here and be opted out of all mass emails. and we honor that. We're good guys. We won't sell their addresses. And then the same guy asked him, he says, well, okay, so then if you have an opt-out, and if you make it really obvious, what is the value to you